If the season of Lent is about deepening a relationship with God, that includes understanding the depth of God's care for us and the width of His planning to reunite us from brokenness, then the question of is it worth it becomes very important for us during the season of Lent. Because to go into a deeper relationship with anyone, but most particularly someone who is shrouded from us, who is somewhat mystery to us, that means that we're having to open ourselves up in a different way than we do in our day-to-day. We're not talking about making friends even of the deepest variety. We are talking about making a relationship with someone who, in our current terminology, is always going to be one up on us in terms of power, in terms of knowing us. And how do you do that? How is it possible to develop a trust? It's one of the biggest questions that we have in our faith relationships today. How do you develop trust in God that moves beyond transactional into a sense of the relationship that exists and that is created even in the knowledge of a power imbalance that evens itself out at the gift of one to another? That sounds complicated, doesn't it? And it is. And one of the things that's helpful to me is to look to the story of the Bible, not simply the admonitions, not even the deep theological discussion, but look to the stories of the Bible. And as I've said lots of times, the book of Genesis has the best stories and thus becomes my favorite book of the Bible. They are not comfortable stories. There are very few comfortable stories in the book of Genesis. It begins with the glorious poetry of the first creation account and then moves quickly into a creation of God that becomes so envious and so jealous of what God has created that they are willing to blow it all up to have one little piece of it for themselves. And then it moves into a world that takes that one little piece of brokenness and builds on it and builds on it and builds on it until the world has become once again such a chaotic, horrible place that God says, I cannot allow this to stand. The flood comes and it starts over again. In the decades, in the hundreds of years after the floods, there comes, however, another story. And it is the story of Abraham and his family around him that includes his wife Sarah, includes a nephew Lot, includes a son Isaac, includes grandchildren and great-grandchildren of great number. But it starts with one person. And Abraham as a person is so important for us to understand because Abraham is the quintessential person who finds door after door closed to them and always continues on the journey looking to open. And reading it through our lens, our expectations of what are proper relationships and proper actions, it is easy to see that there are places that Abraham could have made choices that would have been more comfortable for us. If you look at the story, you see that he did what was necessary to preserve a couple of things. One was to preserve those people for whom he was responsible. His wife, the people who worked with and for him, the people who provided food for other people through the flocks that were his responsibility and his property. But putting aside all of the choices that he made, and I do invite you to look at the chapters of Genesis that are the story of Abraham. The one thing that Abraham does over and over and over again is he listens well to God the first time. And listening well to God the first time enables him to move through the harder times, believing that when all things are impossible, God will open up a way to make the impossible a reality and make it happen. Last Sunday's sermon took some of the scripture from the Abraham story and spoke to the impossible. At the very beginning of God's relationship with Abraham, God makes a promise to Abraham that you will be in relationship with me. I will bless you, and you will be the father of many nations. You will have descendants like the sands of the desert, the stars in the sky. And how do you start to be the grandfather of nations? You have to have a child. And Abraham accepts God's promise, moves into that relationship with him, and the further words that come from God, he is always obedient to God. God says you need to move here, he does. God says do this, he does. And in that obedience, the relationship grows. And the power imbalance is still there, though, isn't it? It's a little bit uncomfortable for us. We want, if Abraham's going to be obedient, we want some kind of proof from God that his obedience is not only of benefit to God, but it is also of benefit to himself. But it doesn't show up. Over and over again, Abraham is disappointed. Sarah, his wife, is disappointed. And the people who are with him are disappointed because it is a fragile system that rests upon one person able to pass along the stability of the community, to pass along the bloodlines that of property and of responsibility. And then Abraham is old. And in his old age, it seems like what God has promised cannot possibly happen. I know that when you read the letters of Paul and they speak about the story of Abraham, last week's lesson said it very clearly. Abraham was old. His wife might as well have been dead. And yet, still, they waited. Abraham has got to be admitted much more calmly and patiently than Sarah. They waited, and though they tried sometimes to circumvent what God had promised, it still was clear for them that God had something for them. As they waited for God to create that way forward, it is that obedience that forms the foundation of community for Abraham and the people around him. It is their relationship and their community that the chosen people who come through after God's promise to Abraham is complete through Isaac, through Jacob, through Jacob's 12 sons and all of their descendants. It is that community that becomes the focus of the scripture and remains the focus of the entire Bible. That God is not only creating a legacy for Abraham, that the legacy that Abraham is creating through his son Isaac, through his grandson Esau and Jacob and their descendants, that legacy is not for one family. It is for all of the families that will be yoked together in their relationship with God. And that relationship that starts off so one-sided becomes never equal, but it is truly an image. Because the people live in the value of God. And they live in the way that God calls them out to live. That is, in Jesus Christ, a relationship that is restored to us over and over again. The fact that God sends Jesus Christ to make clear, make strong, make unbreakable the bonds of that community are the heart of the redemption story that completes on Easter morning with the resurrection of Christ after you move through the cross. When all else is behind us and seems impossible for us to be reconciled to God, for us to be reconciled to one another, God makes the impossible possible. You and I are living in a time where we instantly find out what the next impossible thing is going to be. If we don't see it in social media, we hear it on the news. And we have access 24 hours a day to someone's opinion about what the next impossible thing is. But we also have access 24 hours a day to conversation and community that is created out of a promise that God made to a man called Abraham, and that God cemented and set through a man called Jesus. And in that, God takes and creates the possible out of the impossible. Take a moment to do a personal moment of absolute, total, nothing to do with your life. When I was a child, Rodgers and Hammerstein were two of the most famous composers in the world. They were the creators of The Sound of Music and other South Pacific, other Broadway musicals that have stood the test of time. But they were also the creators of a little television musical called Cinderella. Now, when I was a kid, and even until the time I was a teenager, I could quote, and I might still, decades later, still be able to sing several of the songs of Cinderella word for word. But I know that I do remember that in one of those songs, Rodgers and Hammerstein take the imagery of the impossible being made possible out of community and out of a desire to accept that there are possibilities even in what seems impossible, when they say impossible things happen every day. That, for Abraham, the man who was too old to create a son, could not have grandchildren without the son, certainly could not create nations. It seemed impossible. But still, Abraham believed. God is worthy, because God indeed creates the community, the relationships that make all things possible.